I watched the waiter's pristine white glove tilt the bottle of champagne expertly, filling flutes with golden bubbles that caught the light from the crystal chandeliers. The jazz ensemble in the corner played something smooth and expensive sounding, the kind of music that seems specifically composed for people who own boats and summer homes. Table 23, sir? I looked down at the small card in my hand, turning it over as if there might be some mistake written on the back. Nothing. Just the number 23 printed in elegant cursive on heavy cream cardstock. Yes, I suppose that's me, I replied, straightening the silk tie Juliana had picked out for me this morning. She'd knotted it herself, her fingers brushing against my neck with practiced efficiency. This way, please, the server said, leading me through the main dining area of my father-in-law's sprawling Seattle estate. I caught a glimpse of Juliana across the room, radiant in her emerald dress, laughing at something her brother Marshall had said. Her mother Claudette stood nearby, one hand protectively on Juliana's shoulder, while her other brother re-sipped champagne and nodded along to whatever fascinating family conversation I wasn't a part of. The server kept walking, past the last of the elegantly set tables, through a set of double doors, and into what appeared to be an auxiliary space. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I could see coat racks lined against the far wall. Here we are, sir. Table 23. I stared at the small rickety folding table with a single chair. It stood alone in the corner, illuminated by a single overhead light that buzzed faintly. The linen tablecloth was slightly stained on one corner. There must be some mistake, I said, but the server had already placed a water glass on the table and was walking away. I sat down, feeling the uneven chair wobble beneath me. The muffled sounds of laughter and clinking glasses drifted through the doors, but here I sat alone, separated from my wife's family by walls both literal and figurative. I checked my watch. 30 minutes had passed since I'd arrived at my father-in-law's 70th birthday celebration, and Juliana hadn't even noticed I was missing. I wondered if she'd been the one to assign me this table, or if it had been Claudette's doing. Maybe they'd decided together. I was contemplating whether to go find Juliana when the door swung open and she appeared, looking slightly flushed from champagne and conversation. There you are, she said, her voice carrying a hint of irritation rather than relief. I've been looking all over. Have you? I asked, gesturing to the folding chair in the empty room. I've been right here at table 23. She glanced around as if seeing the room for the first time, then had the decency to look slightly embarrassed. She approached my table, the silk of her dress rustling softly. I didn't realize they'd put you all the way back here, she said, though something in her tone suggested otherwise. Your cousin handed me the card. I figured you knew. Juliana sighed, glancing back toward the door as if worried someone might see her talking to me. Listen, Dad's about to give his speech and then we're cutting the cake. Why don't you just stay here for now and I'll come get you for dessert? Stay here? Alone. She leaned closer, her perfume, the expensive one I'd bought her for our anniversary, enveloping me. It's just easier this way. You know how these family gatherings are. No, Juliana, I said quietly. I don't know how these family gatherings are. I've never been allowed to be part of them. She placed her hand on my shoulder, her diamond wedding ring catching the light. Don't start this again, she whispered. Not tonight. She leaned closer still, her lips nearly touching my ear. I'm sorry, but this is just more comfortable for everyone. You understand, right? Those words, more comfortable for everyone, landed like a physical blow. In that moment, I understood with perfect clarity what I had been to Juliana's family for the past 7 years, an inconvenience. A misfit they tolerated for her sake but never welcomed. I watched her walk away back through the double doors to rejoin her family, leaving me alone with my lukewarm water and wobbly chair. The jazz music swelled in the distance, a soundtrack to my exclusion. My presence was an inconvenience. More comfortable for everyone if I were out of sight. And in that moment something inside me broke. I stared at the empty chair across from me, the silence in this back room deafening compared to the lively celebration beyond the double doors. 7 years. 7 years of marriage to Juliana, and this was where I had ended up, exiled to a wobbly table next to coat racks while her family celebrated without me. The memory of Claudette's voice floated through my mind. Oh, you know Juliana's husband. The mechanic. She'd said it at a Christmas party 3 years ago, introducing me to one of her society friends. I hadn't worked as a mechanic since college, but that label had stuck, a convenient way to explain why I didn't quite fit into their world. I ran my finger along the edge of the tablecloth, remembering Marshall's smirk when he'd seen my car last summer. Still driving that old thing? I thought you'd have upgraded by now. Ree had laughed, clapping his brother on the shoulder before adding, "Some people are just comfortable with less, I suppose." All those evenings I'd spent trying to impress them. The bottles of wine I'd carefully selected, only to have Terence, my father-in-law, casually mention that he preferred a different vintage. The weekend I'd spent fixing his garage door opener instead of going fishing with my friend Gage, hoping it might earn me some respect. The times I'd nodded and smiled through their conversations about vacation properties and investment portfolios, pretending I had something valuable to contribute. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. Through the glass panel in the door, I could see Juliana laughing, her head thrown back, champagne flute in hand. She was standing next to her mother, who had her arm draped possessively around her daughter's shoulders. They looked comfortable together, connected in a way Juliana and I had never been. The realization hit me with sudden clarity. This wasn't a mistake or an oversight. My isolation wasn't accidental. Table 23 wasn't just a random assignment, it was a message. Perhaps it had always been the plan to keep me at a distance, to prevent me from contaminating their precious family circle with my middle-class sensibilities and unrefined tastes. I walked to the coat rack and found my jacket, the one Juliana had frowned at when I put it on earlier today. "Couldn't you wear the cashmere one I bought you?" she'd asked. I'd explained that it was too warm for cashmere, but the truth was simpler. I never felt like myself in the clothes she chose for me. My hand brushed against something in the pocket, Terence's birthday gift. A handcrafted leather wallet I'd spent 2 weeks' salary on, hoping it might finally be the right gift, the one that would make him nod with approval instead of that tight, polite smile that never reached his eyes. I pulled out the small, wrapped package and weighed it in my hand. 7 years of trying to earn a place at their table. 7 years of, "You understand, right?" And, "It's just easier this way." 7 years of being the inconvenient husband, the embarrassing mechanic who somehow managed to marry the princess. Through the glass, I could see Terence now, standing at the head of the main table, about to give a speech. Juliana was watching him adoringly. No one was looking toward the back room. No one had noticed my absence. I slipped the gift back into my pocket. They wouldn't miss the gift any more than they would miss me. I pushed open the door that led directly to the outside rather than back through the main hall. The cool evening air hit my face as I stepped onto the gravel driveway where the valets had parked the less impressive cars, mine among them. "Leaving already, sir?" asked one of the young valets, looking surprised. "Yes," I said, handing him a $20 bill. "I need to go. Would you like me to tell anyone you're leaving?" I paused, looking back at the brightly lit windows of the mansion. I could still hear the jazz music floating through the air, the muffled sound of laughter and clinking glasses. "No," I said finally. "They already know I'm not really here." The drive home was quiet. I didn't turn on the radio, preferring instead to listen to the sound of the engine. The engine I'd rebuilt myself years ago before I met Juliana, when I was still proud of being good with my hands. The farther I got from the mansion, the lighter I felt, as if I were shedding invisible weights with each mile. I thought of what awaited me at home, the empty house, the photographs of Juliana and me on the walls, snapshots of a marriage that looked perfect from the outside. I thought of the drawers full of clothes she had picked out for me, the furniture she had selected, the life she had designed with me as an accessory. As I turned onto our street, I realized something had changed inside me. The embarrassment and hurt had crystallized into something harder, something resolute. Table 23 had shown me my place in Juliana's world with perfect clarity, and I was finally ready to find another place to sit. The house stood dark and silent as I pulled into the driveway. Our 2-story suburban home, Juliana had insisted on this neighborhood, closer to her parents, loomed before me like a stranger's dwelling. I sat in the car for a moment, engine off, listening to the ticking of cooling metal and wondering when exactly our home had stopped feeling like mine. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The lingering scent of Juliana's perfume hung in the air, that expensive French fragrance that always reminded me of department stores and judgment. I flicked on the lights, illuminating the immaculate living room with its precisely arranged throw pillows and the artwork that Claudette had helped select because it really pulls the space together. The leather package in my pocket felt heavier now. I pulled out Terence's birthday gift and tossed it onto the couch, where it landed among the decorative pillows that no one was ever supposed to actually use. The wrapping paper was elegant, dark blue with silver accents, chosen carefully by the store clerk after I'd explained it was for my father-in-law's 70th. "He'll love this," she had assured me. "It's exactly what a successful man would appreciate." I'd nodded, grateful for the validation, desperate to finally get it right. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Juliana. I pulled it out and watched her name flash across the screen, accompanied by the photo she'd insisted I use, her in a sun hat at the vineyard we'd visited last summer, looking like she'd stepped out of a travel magazine. I let it ring until the screen went dark. 3 minutes later, it buzzed again with a text. "Where are you? Why did you leave?" I placed the phone face down on the coffee table without responding. In the kitchen, I opened the refrigerator and stared at the contents: the organic vegetables, the artisanal cheeses, the bottles of sparkling water that Juliana preferred. I grabbed a beer from the back corner, the local brand I kept hidden behind her smoothie ingredients. The familiar anger started to rise, the quiet rage I'd been swallowing for years. But tonight it felt different. Clearer somehow. Less a hot flare of indignation and more a cold, steady certainty. I returned to the living room and picked up Terrence's gift. Carefully, I unwrapped it, sliding my finger under the tape to preserve the paper, a habit I couldn't shake despite Juliana's eye rolling. The leather wallet emerged from its packaging, buttersoft and embossed with Terrence's initials in gold. I'd had to provide ID at the store to prove we shared a last name, the clerk suspicious that someone in my off-the-rack suit was legitimately purchasing such an item. I turned the wallet over in my hands before walking to the kitchen and dropping it into the trash can. The soft thud it made seemed to echo in the empty house. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Juliana. "You're embarrassing me. Call me back." Not, "Are you okay?" or "What happened?" but "You're embarrassing me." 7 years of marriage distilled into 3 revealing words. I took my beer onto the back porch and sat in the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of suburban life. A dog barking, a car door closing, someone's wind chimes tinkling in the gentle evening breeze. I used to fix things for Juliana's family. Their cars, their appliances, their technical problems. "He's so handy," they'd say, as if discussing a convenient tool rather than a person. I wondered what would happen if I stopped being handy. If I stopped trying to fix everything. If I stopped pretending that their approval mattered. By the time I went to bed, in the guest room, a deliberate choice. My phone showed 5 missed calls and several more texts from Juliana. "Where are you? Why aren't you answering? You're acting childish. You left Dad's birthday party without saying goodbye. You're putting me in an awkward position." I switched off the phone and placed it in the drawer of the nightstand. For the first time in years, I didn't care about Juliana's awkward position or her family's opinion. Table 23 had clarified everything. This wasn't about where I sat, but about where I stood in her life. Morning came with pale light filtering through unfamiliar curtains. I'd rarely slept in this room and the bed felt strange, firmer than our mattress, the sheets less soft. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, feeling oddly rested despite everything. In the kitchen I made coffee, my brand, not the imported beans Juliana preferred, and took it to the window overlooking the backyard. The garden she'd hired someone to design looked perfect and impersonal, like something from a magazine spread rather than a space where actual people spent time. My phone, retrieved from the nightstand drawer, showed more missed calls and messages. I scrolled through them without reading, then placed it on the counter. The house was quiet except for the gentle tick of the expensive wall clock Juliana's parents had given us for our 5th anniversary. I sipped my coffee and watched a robin land on the bird feeder outside the window, the one thing in the yard I'd insisted on installing myself. The bird pecked at the seeds, unconcerned with appearances or social standing or whether it belonged. I envied its simplicity, its certainty. And as I stood there, I knew with absolute clarity that I could never go back to being the man at table 23. Whatever came next, whatever storm was brewing, I wouldn't return to that folding chair in the corner. The phone rang again, cutting through the morning silence. I glanced at the screen expecting Juliana's name, but instead saw Gage Sullivan flashing across the display. My oldest friend from college and, conveniently, a divorce attorney. I hesitated before answering, wondering if this was coincidence or if news traveled that fast. "Hey," I said, my voice rougher than I expected. "Morning," Gage replied, his tone casual but careful. "Just checking in. Wanted to see how things went last night at the birthday extravaganza." I laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Oh, it was illuminating." "That bad, huh?" Pause. "Listen, are you at home? Is she there?" "I'm home." "She's not. Still at her parents' place, I assume." Gage exhaled slowly. "Have you decided what you're going to do about, what we talked about 3 months ago?" My mind flashed back to that evening in April. I'd picked up Juliana's phone to order takeout when a notification had appeared, a message from someone named Derek that started with, "Can't wait to feel you." The rest had been cut off by the preview, but it was enough. Enough to make me open the message thread and discover months of conversations between my wife and her Pilates instructor. "I haven't decided," I said, moving to the window and staring out at the perfectly manicured lawn. But last night pushed me closer to a decision. What happened? I told him about Table 23, about Juliana's dismissive words, about driving home alone while jazz music faded behind me. Jesus, Gage said when I finished. That's cold even for her. It clarified things, I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Made me realize this isn't just about Derek. Speaking of which, Gage said, his tone shifting to something more professional, I did some digging into those financial records you sent me. After discovering the affair, I'd begun paying more attention to our accounts. Small discrepancies at first, unexplained withdrawals, strange credit card charges, but then I'd found evidence of a private account in Juliana's name, funded with transfers from our joint savings. What did you find? She's been systematically moving money for at least 8 months. Small amounts at first, then larger transfers. Based on the timing, it started about 2 months before her involvement with Derek. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window. How much? Just over $78,000. The number hung in the air between us. Almost $80,000 of our shared savings, money we'd supposedly been setting aside for a vacation home, a future that now seemed like a cruel joke. That's nearly half of what we had saved, I said. Yes. And given your prenuptial agreement, this constitutes a clear violation. She was explicitly prohibited from creating separate accounts with joint funds without your knowledge. I remembered signing that agreement, Juliana insisting it was just a formality, her family's way of protecting generational assets. The irony wasn't lost on me. So what now? I asked. That depends on what you want, Gage replied. You have options. We could start with a letter demanding the return of funds, or we could file directly. Given the evidence of infidelity and financial misconduct, you're in a strong position. I turned away from the window and walked through the living room, past the photographs of Juliana and me smiling at charity events, at ski resorts, on beaches, a curated display of marital happiness. I need to think, I said finally. This isn't just about the money or even the affair. Last night made me realize something I've been avoiding for years. I don't belong in her world and she's never wanted me to. Take your time, Gage said. But don't wait too long. If she suspects you know about the account, she might start covering her tracks. After we hung up, I sat on the couch, turning my wedding ring around my finger. The platinum band had always felt slightly too heavy, too constrictive. Juliana had insisted on platinum when I'd suggested gold, just as she'd insisted on the neighborhood, the furniture, the clothes hanging in my closet. My phone buzzed with a text from her. Coming home soon. We need to talk. No apology. No acknowledgement of what had happened. Just a summons as if I were an employee being called into her office. I thought about the evidence stored in my personal email account. Screenshots of messages between Juliana and Derek, bank statements showing the unauthorized transfers, a documented timeline of her deceptions. 3 months of quiet investigation while I tried to decide whether to confront her or simply walk away. Table 23 had made the decision for me. It wasn't just about where I'd been seated, it was about where I stood in her life. On the periphery. Out of sight. An inconvenience to be managed rather than a partner to be cherished. I texted back, yes we do. Then I called Gage again. I've made my decision, I said when he answered. I want out. Completely. Start the paperwork. Are you sure? He asked. This isn't something you can undo easily. I looked around at the house that had never felt like mine, at the life I'd been trying to fit into for 7 years. I'm sure, I said. I'm done sitting at table 23. The sound of Juliana's key in the lock came just after 6 in the evening. I was sitting in the living room, a glass of whiskey on the coffee table in front of me, untouched. The house had grown darker as the day progressed, but I hadn't bothered turning on any lights. The door opened and she swept in with the particular energy she always carried, a mixture of authority and impatience. She flicked on the light switch, illuminating the room and me in one abrupt gesture. There you are, she said as if I were a misplaced item she'd been searching for. She wore the same emerald dress from last night, but her hair was slightly disheveled, and her makeup showed signs of wear. She dropped her purse on the entryway table. We need to talk about your behavior last night. I didn't stand to greet her. Didn't offer to take her coat. Just watched as she navigated the space between us, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor like a countdown. My behavior, I repeated, my voice even. Yes, your behavior. She crossed her arms, standing over me. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it was to discover my husband had simply vanished in the middle of Dad's birthday? Without saying a word to anyone? I said a word to the valet. Her eyes narrowed. This isn't funny. My mother was asking where you'd gone. Ree and Marshall thought you were in the bathroom for an hour. Dad was opening presents, and you weren't there to see him open yours. I'm sure table 23 was the first place they looked for me. Something in my tone made her pause. She studied my face more carefully, noticing perhaps the unusual stillness in my posture, the untouched whiskey, the wedding ring sitting on the coffee table beside it. What's that supposed to mean? She asked, her voice losing some of its edge. It means I know my place now, Juliana. I've finally figured out where I stand with you and your family. She sighed dramatically, kicking off her heels and sinking into the armchair across from me. Are we really going to do this now? I had to leave Dad's brunch early to come deal with your, whatever this is, this childish sulking. I know about Derek, I said quietly. The words landed between us like a physical object. Juliana froze, her expression cycling rapidly through surprise, denial, and calculation. Derek? She repeated, her voice artificially light. Derek who? Your Pilates instructor. The one you've been sleeping with for the past 5 months. The one who texts you that he can't wait to feel you wrapped around him again. Her face drained of color, but she recovered quickly. You've been going through my phone? Invading my privacy? I wasn't going through your phone. A message appeared while I was ordering dinner that night. You were working late. I kept my voice calm, detached. But yes, after that I did look. Extensively. She stared at me, then glanced away, her shoulders slumping slightly. It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think. It was a mistake. It didn't mean anything. I nodded slowly. And the $78,000 you've been transferring to your private account? Did that mean anything? Her head snapped up, eyes widening. How did you? Does it matter? I know, Juliana. I know about the account at First Republic. I know about the transfers from our joint savings. I know everything. She was silent for a long moment, her breathing shallow. I could almost see her mind working, recalculating, forming a new strategy. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, conciliatory. I can explain. I was scared. My mother suggested I should have some financial independence. It wasn't about taking from you. It was about security. Security from what? From me? The husband who spent 7 years trying to fit into your world? Who's tolerated being treated like an embarrassing accessory by your family? That's not fair, she said, leaning forward. You've never really tried to fit in. You always hold yourself apart, acting like you're too good for our traditions, our friends. I laughed, a sharp sound that surprised even me. Is that what you think? That I've been holding myself apart? That I'm the one who put myself at table 23? Table? She stopped, realization crossing her face. Is that what this is about? The seating arrangements? For God's sake, it was just logistics. The main tables were for family. And I'm not family. Not after 7 years of marriage. You know what I mean. I do know what you mean. That's the problem, Juliana. I finally understand exactly what you mean. She stood up abruptly, pacing across the living room. You're blowing this out of proportion. Yes, I made a mistake with Derek. And yes, maybe I should have told you about the account. But these are things we can work through. Couples therapy, maybe. I want a divorce. The words hung in the air between us. Juliana stopped pacing and stared at me, her expression shifting from frustration to disbelief. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Because of a seating chart? Because I put you at a different table? Because you've never wanted me at your table? Not really. I've spent 7 years trying to earn a place in your world, and last night just confirmed what I should have realized long ago. It's never going to happen. Her face hardened, the vulnerability vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. You've never tried hard enough. If you had just made more effort with my family, things could have been different. That was it, the final confirmation I needed. In her mind, the failure was mine. Always mine. You're right about one thing, I said, standing up at last. Things could have been different. But they're not. And they never will be. 2 days after my confrontation with Juliana, the doorbell rang. She had stormed out after our argument, taking a suitcase and not bothering to say where she was going. I assumed she'd retreated to her parents' mansion, where her mother would console her about her ungrateful husband while pouring expensive wine. I opened the door expecting a delivery or perhaps Gage dropping by to check on me. Instead, I found myself face to face with Terrence, my father-in-law. He stood alone on the porch, no sign of Claudette or the children. In all the years I'd known him, I couldn't recall a single instance when he'd come to our home without his wife by his side. He looked different outside his natural habitat of wealth and influence, smaller somehow, less commanding in the ordinary sunlight of a suburban afternoon. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual authoritative tone. "I'd like to speak with you. It won't take long." I hesitated, my hand still on the door. Part of me wanted to shut it in his face, to let him feel a fraction of the exclusion I'd experienced at his birthday celebration. But curiosity won out. "Sure," I said, stepping aside. "Come in." He entered cautiously, as if stepping into foreign territory rather than his daughter's home. His eyes swept across the living room, taking in the space with an appraising glance, a habit of the perpetually wealthy, I supposed, always calculating the value of their surroundings. "Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" I offered, more out of ingrained politeness than genuine hospitality. "No, thank you." He remained standing, hands clasped behind his back. "I'll be direct. Juliana told us you're seeking a divorce." Of course she had. I wondered what version of events she'd shared with her parents. "That's right," I confirmed. "She says there's been a misunderstanding. That you're overreacting to something trivial because of insecurities." He delivered this assessment with the careful neutrality of someone repeating an unpleasant diagnosis. "Did she mention the affair? Or the $78,000 she transferred from our joint savings to a private account without my knowledge?" Terrence's expression flickered, surprise quickly masked. "She mentioned some disagreements about finances. Nothing about an affair." A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Disagreements about finances. That's one way to describe theft. "Those are serious allegations," he said, his lawyer's caution evident in his tone. "They're not allegations. They're facts." I walked to the desk in the corner, opened my laptop and pulled up the folder I'd been compiling for months. Evidence that Gage had assured me would be more than sufficient in divorce proceedings. I gestured for Terrence to come look. He approached slowly, like a man walking toward his own execution. I clicked through the files methodically, screenshots of text messages between Juliana and Derek, photos I'd taken of them entering a hotel together, bank statements showing the systematic transfers to her hidden account. Terrence stared at the screen, his face gradually hardening as the evidence mounted. When I finished, he stood in silence, eyes still fixed on the final bank statement. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Would you have believed me over your daughter?" I countered. He didn't answer, which was answer enough. "Besides," I continued, "I didn't want to be the cause of a family rift, and I kept hoping she might stop. That it was just a phase or something. That she'd come back to our marriage." Terrence turned to face me, really looking at me perhaps for the first time in 7 years. The calculating gaze was gone, replaced by something that resembled respect, or at least recognition. "I need to make a call," he said abruptly, pulling out his phone. "Go ahead. You can use the back porch if you want privacy." He nodded and stepped outside. Through the window, I could see him pacing as he spoke, his free hand gesturing emphatically. After a few minutes, he ended the call and returned. "Claudette and Juliana are on their way over," he announced, his tone now resolute. "I don't think that's necessary." "It is," he interrupted. "This needs to be addressed as a family." "I'm not part of your family," I reminded him. "That's been made abundantly clear." He flinched slightly, then straightened his shoulders. "You're my daughter's husband. That makes you family whether we've acted accordingly or not." We sat in uncomfortable silence while waiting. Terrence perched on the edge of the sofa as if afraid to fully commit to sitting in my living room. I made coffee more to have something to do than out of actual desire for caffeine. Claudette arrived first, her luxury SUV pulling into the driveway with uncharacteristic speed. She burst through the door without knocking, looking wildly around until she spotted Terrence. "What's going on?" she demanded. "Your message said it was urgent." Before either of us could answer, another car pulled up, Juliana's sleek convertible. She entered more cautiously than her mother, her eyes darting between the three of us, clearly trying to assess the situation. When she saw her father's grave expression and the open laptop, understanding dawned on her face. She paled visibly, her carefully composed facade cracking. "Dad?" she said, her voice small like a child caught in a lie. Terrence held up the stack of papers I'd printed for him, the most damning evidence presented in neat, irrefutable black and white. "Is this true?" he asked his daughter. In that moment, watching Juliana confront the consequences of her actions, I felt no satisfaction, no vindication. Just a profound sadness for what could have been, for the marriage I'd tried so hard to make work, and for the family I'd never truly been allowed to join. The silence in our living room was deafening. Juliana stood frozen by the doorway, her eyes fixed on the papers in her father's hand. Claudette looked between her husband and daughter, confusion giving way to dawning horror as she began to understand what was happening. "Terence, what is this about?" Claudette asked, her voice sharp with anxiety. Terence didn't look at his wife. His gaze remained locked on Juliana. "Answer the question," he said, his voice unnaturally calm. "Is this true?" Juliana's eyes darted to me, then back to her father. I could almost see the calculations running behind them, weighing denials against excuses, looking for escape routes. "Dad, you can't possibly believe." "The evidence is right here," Terence cut her off, waving the papers. "Bank statements, text messages, photos. So I'll ask you once more, is this true?" Her shoulders slumped, the perfect posture she'd maintained since childhood finally giving way. "It's complicated." "That's not an answer," he pressed. Claudette snatched the papers from Terence's hand, her eyes widening as she scanned the contents. A small gasp escaped her as she reached the photos of Juliana entering the hotel with Derek. "Oh my God," she whispered, sinking into the nearest chair. "Juliana, how could you?" Juliana's expression hardened, her momentary vulnerability replaced by defiance. "You don't understand. Our marriage has been struggling for a long time." She gestured toward me. "He's never fit in with us, with our life. He doesn't try." "So you cheated on him?" Terence asked. "You stole money from your joint savings?" "I didn't steal anything," she snapped. "That money is as much mine as his. I was just protecting my interests." I'd been silent throughout this exchange, watching the family dynamics I'd observed for years play out in a new context. But now I spoke up. "You were planning to leave. You were creating your escape fund." Her eyes met mine, and for a moment the pretense dropped. "Maybe I was. What difference does it make now?" "The difference," Terence said, "is that you lied to everyone. To your husband. To your mother and me. You told us he was being unreasonable, that he was threatening divorce over a seating arrangement." Claudette looked up from the papers, her carefully maintained makeup now streaked with tears. "Why, Juliana? Why would you do this?" "Because she never respected our marriage," I said quietly. "Because to her, I was always an inconvenience, something to be managed and kept at a distance. Just like at your birthday party, Terence. Table 23 wasn't a mistake. It was a perfect symbol of where I stand in this family." Juliana laughed, a brittle sound that filled the room. "You see? This is exactly the problem. Everything is always about how victimized he feels, how excluded. He never tried to be part of this family. He never made an effort to belong." "That's not true," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "I spent 7 years trying to belong. I learned about wine for your father. I fixed things around your parents' house. I wore the clothes you picked out. I went to charity events I couldn't afford. I did everything except change who I fundamentally am, and that was the only thing that would have satisfied you." Terence turned to his daughter, his expression grave. "Is that how you presented him to us? As someone who didn't try?" Juliana's silence was answer enough. "Because," Terence continued, "I remember him offering to teach me about engines when my car broke down. I remember him spending an entire weekend fixing our garage door when the repair company couldn't come for weeks. I remember him bringing that exceptional bottle of Bordeaux to Christmas dinner, the one I complimented but never properly thanked him for." I stared at Terence, stunned. I had assumed he barely noticed those efforts, that he saw them as the obligations of a son-in-law rather than genuine attempts to connect. "What I don't remember," Terence said, his voice growing harder, "is us ever truly welcoming him. That's on us, Juliana. On me, your mother, your brothers. We never gave him a real chance." "Don't you dare take his side," Juliana hissed, her composure fully cracking now. "After everything I've done to maintain our family's image, to be the perfect daughter." "Perfect?" Claudette interrupted, standing up with the papers clutched in her hand. "You call this perfect? Cheating on your husband? Hiding money? Lying to us all?" "I did what I had to do." "No," I said. "You did what you wanted to do. There's a difference." Juliana looked at each of us in turn, perhaps realizing for the first time that she stood alone, without allies. Her face contorted with a mixture of rage and panic. "I can't believe this. You're all against me now." No one answered. The accusation hung in the air, revealing more about Juliana's worldview than she perhaps intended. This binary perspective where people were either for her or against her, with no room for nuance or accountability. "I can't deal with this right now," she said finally, grabbing her purse. "I'm leaving." "Juliana, wait," Claudette started, but Terence put a hand on his wife's arm. "Let her go," he said softly. "She needs time to realize that actions have consequences." We watched in silence as Juliana stormed out, slamming the door behind her with enough force to rattle the windows. The sound of her car engine revving filled the air, followed by the screech of tires as she peeled away from the house. In her wake, the three of us remained, connected now by a shared understanding that had been 7 years in the making, and by the painful recognition of how those years might have been different. The echo of the slammed door seemed to linger in the air, followed by an uncomfortable silence. I stood awkwardly in my own living room, suddenly unsure of my place in this strange new configuration. Just me and my in-laws without Juliana as the connecting thread between us. Claudette broke the silence first, dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief she'd pulled from her purse. "I need to sit down," she said, her voice uncharacteristically fragile. She lowered herself onto the couch, looking around as if seeing our house for the first time. Terence remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in that formal posture he always maintained, though something in his stance had softened. "Would it be possible to have a drink?" he asked, clearing his throat. "Of course," I replied, grateful for the simple task. "I have whiskey, gin, wine." "Whiskey, please." "Neat. Claudette? Can I get you anything?" She looked up, her perfectly maintained facade crumbling around the edges. "White wine if you have it. Or vodka tonic." I went to the kitchen, hearing their hushed voices behind me but unable to make out the words. When I returned with their drinks, they fell silent, accepting the glasses with murmured thanks. Claudette took a long sip of her wine, then set it down carefully on a coaster. She looked directly at me, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "I owe you an apology," she said. The words hung in the air between us, so unexpected that for a moment I wasn't sure I'd heard them correctly. "For what exactly?" I asked, not unkindly. "For not giving you a fair chance," she replied, her voice steady now. "For judging you based on things that don't matter." I sat down across from them, cradling my own drink. "You never knew me," I said simply. "Not really." "That's the point," Terence said, taking a seat beside his wife. "We never tried to know you. We saw what we expected to see, what Juliana led us to see." "Which was what?" Terence sighed, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Someone not good enough for our daughter. Someone who couldn't possibly understand our world. Someone temporary." The last word stung, though it merely confirmed what I'd suspected for years. "Temporary," I repeated. 7 years of temporary. "She always presented you as a burden," Claudette admitted, her gaze dropping to her wine glass. "She'd call us after visiting your friends, complaining about how uncomfortable she felt, how out of place. She'd mention things you said or did that embarrassed her, while simultaneously telling me how her family criticized me behind my back." I said, the pieces finally clicking into place. "She played both sides. Made me feel like I needed to constantly prove myself to you, while telling you I wasn't even trying." "A double game," Terence nodded, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Keeping everyone off balance, maintaining her position as the injured party." "She's always been good at that," Claudette murmured, almost to herself. "Even as a child. Never her fault, always someone else's." A heavy silence fell over us as we each processed this shared revelation. I thought of the countless dinners where Juliana had squeezed my hand under the table, a gesture I'd interpreted as support but now recognized as warning. The times she'd spoken for me in conversations, the way she'd subtly correct my table manners or interrupt when I was sharing a story from my past. "I want you to know," Terence said, breaking the silence, "that I intend to recover the money she took from your joint account." I shook my head. "That's not necessary. This isn't about the money." "Nevertheless," he insisted. "It's the right thing to do." "What happens now?" Claudette asked, looking between us. "With the divorce, I mean." "My lawyer is preparing the paperwork," I replied. "Given the circumstances, it should be straightforward. I'm not asking for anything beyond what's legally mine." She nodded slowly, then surprised me by reaching across the coffee table to touch my hand briefly. "I hope you won't disappear completely," she said. "I know we've given you no reason to stay in touch, but we'd like to know how you're doing," Terence finished for her. "From time to time." The sincerity in their voices was jarring, so different from the polite formality I'd grown accustomed to over the years. I wondered if this was who they really were beneath the social veneer, or if shock had temporarily stripped away their usual defenses. "I'm not planning to vanish," I assured them, though until this moment, I hadn't given much thought to what my relationship with Juliana's family would be after the divorce. "But things will be different." "Everything will be different," Claudette sighed, finishing her wine. We sat together for another hour, the conversation shifting to practical matters. The logistics of the divorce, concerns about how Juliana might react, whether Ree and Marshall should be told the full story. It was the most honest discussion I'd ever had with my in-laws, and it came just as our legal connection was about to be severed. When they finally stood to leave, Terrence extended his hand to me, not the perfunctory handshake of previous years, but a firm grip, his eyes meeting mine with newfound respect. "I'm sorry we didn't see you," he said simply. "I'm sorry it took this to make us look." As their car pulled away from the curb, I stood in the doorway watching the taillights recede into the distance. I felt a complex mixture of vindication and regret, satisfaction that the truth had finally emerged, sadness for what might have been had it come to light years earlier. The house felt different when I closed the door, emptier certainly but also somehow lighter, as if the weight of pretense had been lifted along with the secrets. 2 months passed like a strange fever dream, a blur of meetings with Gage, paperwork to sign, and the slow, methodical dismantling of the life Juliana and I had built together. I'd moved into a temporary apartment, a furnished one-bedroom near downtown that felt more like a hotel than a home. White walls, generic furniture, and a sterile emptiness that somehow suited my transitional state. The divorce proceedings lurched forward with all the grace of a wounded animal. What should have been straightforward, given the prenuptial agreement and the clear evidence of Juliana's infidelity and financial misconduct, had become unnecessarily complicated by her resistance. She switched attorneys again. Gage informed me over coffee one morning, his expression a mixture of annoyance and grudging admiration. "That's the third one in 6 weeks. She's clearly shopping for someone who'll tell her what she wants to hear." "Which is what, exactly?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "That she can contest the prenup. That she deserves half of everything despite the affair and the hidden account." He shook his head. "It won't work, but she can certainly drag things out." And drag things out she did. Depositions were scheduled and rescheduled. Financial disclosures were submitted with convenient omissions that required follow-up requests. Each court appearance became an exercise in restraint as I sat across from her, watching her whisper urgently to her latest attorney. She looked different now, harder somehow, the polished veneer of the society wife giving way to something more desperate. Her carefully highlighted hair had grown out slightly, revealing darker roots. The designer outfits had been replaced by more severe business attire, as if she were dressing for battle rather than a social occasion. I'd received a handful of texts from her over the weeks, alternating between accusations, "You've turned my entire family against me," and attempts at reconciliation, "We could still make this work if you'd just be reasonable." I'd responded to the practical questions about property division but ignored the emotional salvos. Then came the request I couldn't ignore, an invitation to meet in person, just the two of us without lawyers present. "Don't do it," Gage warned. "Nothing good can come from an off-the-record conversation at this stage." But curiosity won out. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown that neither of us had frequented during our marriage. She arrived 15 minutes late, a power move I recognized from her business negotiations. "You look well," she said, sliding into the chair across from me, her eyes scanning my face for signs of distress or longing. "What do you want, Juliana?" I asked, skipping the pretense of small talk. She sighed dramatically. "Always so direct. That's one thing I miss about you." When I didn't respond, she continued, "I wanted to see if we could resolve this amicably without dragging it out further. It's becoming exhausting. It could have been simple. The prenup is clear. You were the one who contested it." "Because it's not fair," she snapped, then quickly composed herself. "I mean, circumstances change. We've been married 7 years. That should count for something." "It counted for something until you started sleeping with your Pilates instructor and hiding money from me." Her eyes flashed. "That was a mistake. I've said that repeatedly. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or burning dinner. What you did was a deliberate choice. Multiple choices over months." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "And what about your choices? If you'd made more of an effort with my family, if you'd tried harder to fit into my world, none of this would have happened." There it was again, the same refrain. My failure to become someone else was the justification for her betrayal. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me, recognizing the pattern that had defined our marriage from the beginning. The problem isn't that I didn't try hard enough. I said quietly. It's that I tried for too long. Something in my tone must have reached her, because her expression shifted, the calculated charm giving way to genuine frustration. You know, they barely speak to me now? My own parents. They treat me like I'm some kind of criminal. What did you expect? I expected loyalty. They're my family. And I was your husband. She fell silent, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her untouched coffee cup. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its hard edge. Listen, I have a proposal. I'll stop contesting the prenup if you agree not to submit certain evidence during the proceedings. You mean the photos? The text messages? She nodded, not meeting my eyes. My reputation is important to me. I can't have those details becoming public record. I studied her face, wondering if this was the first genuine concern she'd expressed throughout our entire divorce. Not grief over our failed marriage or regret for her actions, but fear for her social standing. I'm not interested in humiliating you, Juliana. I never was. I just want what's legally mine and to move on with my life. Relief flooded her features. So we have a deal? You'll keep the details private and I'll stop fighting the terms of the prenup. Yes, I agreed. But no more delays, no more canceled depositions, no more forgetting to disclose assets. Done. She extended her hand across the table, as if we were concluding a business transaction rather than negotiating the end of our marriage. As I shook her hand, I realized this was perhaps the most honest interaction we'd had in years, a straightforward exchange of terms without the pretense of emotion. In a strange way, it was almost refreshing. For what it's worth, she said as she gathered her purse to leave, I did love you. In my way. I nodded, neither accepting nor rejecting her statement. Goodbye, Juliana. She hesitated for a moment, perhaps waiting for something more, forgiveness perhaps, or an admission that I still cared. When neither came, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the tile floor like the final beats of a song that had played too long. 6 months after that fateful night at table 23, the divorce was finally complete. The paperwork had been signed, assets divided, and separate lives officially recognized by law. The process had been exhausting, but in the end Juliana had kept her word. Once we'd reached our private agreement, the legal proceedings had moved forward without further obstruction. I stood at the kitchen sink in my new apartment, washing dishes from the dinner party I'd hosted the night before. It was a modest 2-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood, nothing like the showcase home Juliana and I had shared. The furniture was an eclectic mix of pieces I'd claimed in the divorce and new items I'd selected myself. Nothing matched perfectly, but everything felt comfortable. Gage and his wife Lisa had come over for dinner, the first real social gathering I'd hosted since moving in. I'd cooked everything myself. Nothing fancy, just a simple pasta dish with fresh bread and a decent bottle of wine that I'd chosen without worrying whether it would impress anyone. We'd sat at my small dining table, just the three of us, with no extra chairs for show and no coat racks nearby. The conversation had flowed easily, punctuated by genuine laughter and comfortable silences. No one had checked their watch or made excuses to leave early. No one had corrected my table setting or subtly rearranged the food on their plate. As I rinsed the last glass, my phone buzzed with a text message. I dried my hands and checked the screen, surprised to see Terrence's name. Since our unexpected bonding after Juliana's dramatic exit, we'd maintained sporadic contact, mostly brief, polite exchanges updating each other on our lives. In town for a meeting. Coffee tomorrow? I typed back a simple agreement and suggested a cafe downtown, far from the upscale establishments his family usually frequented. The next day, I spotted Terrence immediately, looking slightly out of place in the casual coffee shop with his tailored suit and carefully groomed appearance. He'd aged in the past 6 months, the lines around his eyes deeper, his posture less rigid. Thanks for meeting me, he said as I sat down across from him. I'm only in town for the day. How are you? I asked, genuinely curious. Despite everything, I developed an unexpected respect for the man who'd finally seen beyond his daughter's manipulations. Managing, he replied with a wry smile. Claudette sends her regards. We exchanged pleasantries, discussing his business ventures and my new job at a software company, a significant departure from my previous position, but one that offered fresh challenges and a clean break from the past. Juliana seeing someone new, he said eventually, studying my reaction over the rim of his coffee cup. Some investment banker from Chicago. They met at a charity function last month. I nodded, feeling neither jealousy nor concern, just a detached curiosity. Is he good for her? Terrence sighed. Hard to say. He seems accommodating, eager to please. He paused. Rather like you were in the beginning. We shared a knowing look, both recognizing the pattern. I wondered if this new man would eventually find himself at his own version of Table 23, or if Juliana had learned anything from our marriage's collapse. I should thank you, Terence said unexpectedly. For what? For making us see the truth about our daughter. His voice held no accusation, just the weary acceptance of a father who'd finally recognized his child's flaws. It's been enlightening. Painful but necessary. We finished our coffee in companionable silence. As we prepared to leave, Terence extended his hand, not the formal, obligatory handshake of our early acquaintance, but a warm gesture between equals. Take care of yourself, he said simply. You too, I replied, meaning it. Walking home afterward, I took the long route through the park, enjoying the crisp autumn air and the colored leaves crunching beneath my feet. I thought about Terence's words and the subtle shift they represented. From being the outsider who had failed to adapt to their world, I had somehow become the catalyst for their own reassessment. Back in my apartment, I made a fresh cup of coffee and took it out to my small balcony. A bird landed on the railing, a sparrow ordinary but vibrant with life. It cocked its head, regarding me with bright, curious eyes before fluttering to a nearby branch. I thought about the lesson of the past 6 months. How people treat you is, in many ways, a reflection of what you allow. 4 years, I'd accepted my place on the periphery of Juliana's life, constantly striving for approval that never came. I'd let myself become the person at Table 23, grateful for any acknowledgement, however condescending. My phone buzzed with a message from Gage, asking if I wanted to join him and some friends for a baseball game that weekend. I typed back an immediate yes, smiling at the simple pleasure of making plans without negotiation or apology. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across my balcony as I finished my coffee. In the distance, I could see the gleaming high-rises of downtown where Juliana's world continued to spin. Elegant parties, strategic alliances, carefully curated appearances. I no longer felt excluded from that realm. I simply recognized it wasn't where I belonged. Perhaps the most valuable thing I'd gained from losing my marriage wasn't freedom or self-respect, though both were precious. It was clarity, the understanding that sometimes you have to walk away for others to recognize your worth. But more importantly, you have to recognize it yourself. I went inside and added Gage's game to my calendar, already looking forward to the weekend. My new life was smaller in some ways than what I'd had with Juliana, less luxurious, less impressive on paper. But it was mine, authentic and uncompromised. And there wasn't a Table 23 in sight.